A quiet town finds itself at the center of a dangerous conspiracy when a series of coordinated attacks unfold at its local zoo. What begins as an apparent accident, two escaped predators causing panic, quickly reveals itself to be something far more calculated. The animals were released on purpose, and the deeper the investigation goes, the clearer it becomes that someone wants the zoo gone for good. John Harris, a man who came to Fairhaven looking for solitude, never planned on getting involved. But when he finds himself face to face with the danger, something inside him won't let him walk away. Alongside Detective Cole Barrett, an officer struggling to keep the peace in a town that suddenly feels like a battleground, and Kate Dawson, a zookeeper fighting to protect the animals in her care, John begins unraveling a plot that stretches far beyond a few acts of vandalism. Corrupt developers, powerful figures pulling strings from the shadows, and hired men who don't think twice about silencing those who get in their way have turned the town into their chessboard. As John gets closer to the truth, the stakes rise. The attacks escalate from broken locks and loose animals to fire, gunmen, and threats that go beyond intimidation. The people responsible are growing desperate, and they aren't afraid to spill blood to get what they want. As the final confrontation looms, John is faced with a choice: walk away before it's too late, or risk everything to stop them. But John Harris isn't the kind of man who backs down. The town of Fairhaven may not know it yet, but it's about to find out just how far one man will go to protect something worth saving. And as the night stretches on, one thing becomes clear: not all cages are made for animals, and not all threats come with claws. Hold on a moment before we move forward. Let us know where in the world you're watching from. And if you're loving these stories, don't forget to hit subscribe. Tomorrow's episode is going to be absolutely mind-blowing. The sun rose over Fairhaven, a quiet town tucked between rolling green hills and a winding river that shimmered in the morning light. It was the kind of place where people still left their doors unlocked, where life moved at a slow and steady rhythm, a town untouched by chaos. For most, today would be just another normal day, but not for everyone. At the edge of town, the Fairhaven Zoo stood as one of its few attractions, a place where families gathered on weekends to watch lions bask in the sun and monkeys swing from ropes. On this particular Saturday, the gates had just opened, welcoming a steady stream of visitors eager to enjoy the warm summer morning. Among them was Emily Dawson, an energetic 8-year-old girl with a head full of bouncing curls and a boundless enthusiasm for animals. She practically pulled her father, David Dawson, through the entrance, her tiny sneakers slapping against the pavement as she tugged on his hand. "Come on, Daddy! We have to see the bears before they go back to sleep," she urged, her voice filled with excitement. David chuckled, shaking his head as he let himself be dragged along. "Sweetheart, the bears don't have a bedtime," he teased. "They do in the cartoons," she countered, her blue eyes lighting up with determination. "They sleep all day. If we don't hurry, they'll be snoring." David gave a resigned sigh and followed her toward the Grizzly bear exhibit, weaving through the small crowds of parents, strollers and teenagers with overpriced sodas in hand. Across the street, outside the zoo's perimeter, John Harris sat on a weathered wooden bench, sipping his morning coffee. He didn't come for the zoo. He came for the quiet. The park just outside the zoo entrance had become his refuge over the past few years. A place to sit in the early hours, watch the town wake up, and feel the warmth of a fresh cup of coffee between his hands. At 59 years old, John was a man used to solitude. His days in the military had left him with more scars than he cared to admit. Some visible, others buried deep where no one could see. He wasn't much for conversation anymore, and he certainly wasn't one for crowds. He preferred to watch from a distance, and so he sat, gazing absently at the families hurrying inside, their laughter carrying on the breeze. A part of him envied their ease, their simplicity. A father and daughter rushed past him toward the gates, the little girl talking a mile a minute, her curly hair bouncing in the sunlight. John found himself smiling just for a second. Then he turned back to his coffee. It was just another morning, just another normal day, or so he thought. Inside the Fairhaven Zoo, the air was filled with the chatter of families and the occasional calls of exotic animals greeting the morning. Children ran ahead of their parents, pressing their faces against enclosures, pointing at the creatures inside with wide-eyed wonder. But amid the cheerful commotion, something was wrong. Mark Evans wiped the sweat from his brow as he finished up the morning rounds, double-checking the locks on the animal enclosures. He was running on 3 hours of sleep and a bad hangover, thanks to a late-night poker game that had gone longer than expected. His uniform was wrinkled, his eyes bloodshot, but he told himself it didn't matter. He'd done this 100 times before. What was the worst that could happen? Mark barely glanced at the latch on the grizzly bear's gate as he jotted down a few notes in his checklist. He didn't see the way the lock hung just slightly loose, didn't notice the tension in the air inside the bear enclosure, and he definitely didn't see the eyes watching him from the shadows. Inside the cage, the massive grizzly bear, a 900-pound behemoth of raw muscle and instinct, shifted its weight, sniffing the air. It had been restless for days. Captivity had dulled its senses, but not its nature. Something in the wind today smelled different, free. The bear's dark eyes locked onto the latch, its massive shoulders tensed. A deep growl rumbled in its chest as it took a single step forward, and then it lunged. With one swipe of its enormous paw, the gate rattled violently. The lock, already weakened from months of wear and neglect, snapped loose with a sharp clink. For a moment, there was silence. Then, the door swung open. The grizzly took its first step into the open world. The zoo had just become a hunting ground. The chaos unleashed. It started as a murmur, confused voices carrying through the air, barely noticeable over the normal hustle of the zoo. Then came the first scream. Visitors turned their heads, their relaxed conversations forgotten, as the sound spread like a wave, growing in urgency. Somewhere near the bear exhibit, a woman shrieked, clutching her child to her chest. Then another voice, and another. The crowd shifted, the easy pace of mourning turning into something jagged, erratic. People moved faster, their steps uncertain. And then, "Run!" The voice was raw with terror, and suddenly the zoo was a stampede. Parents grabbed their children. Hands tightened on strollers, feet pounded the pavement. Someone knocked over a food cart in their rush to flee, sending bags of popcorn and soda cans scattering across the ground. A teenage girl tripped over a bench and hit the ground hard, gasping as the crowd surged past her. Security officers shouted into their radios, their voices lost in the chaos. "We have a breach! The grizzly! Oh, God, it's loose!" In the middle of the madness, Emily Dawson stood frozen. She hadn't run. She hadn't moved at all. Her small body trembled as she stared at the bear, now fully outside of its enclosure, its powerful shoulders rippling with every slow step forward. She was too young to understand the weight of her own fear, too small to comprehend the sheer size of the beast in front of her. Emily had spent her entire life watching animals on TV, listening to her teachers tell her that bears weren't scary unless you made them angry. She wasn't doing anything, so why was it looking at her? The bear lifted its nose, sniffing the air, locking onto her scent. And then it charged. A soldier's reflexes. John Harris heard the screams before he saw the chaos. From his park bench, the morning had been peaceful just moments ago, a warm cup of coffee, a slight breeze, the simple rhythm of a quiet town. Now, panic. The flood of people rushing toward the zoo's exit told him something was very, very wrong. Then he saw it. The bear. 900 pounds of fury and instinct, moving like a freight train through the zoo, and the little girl alone. John didn't hesitate. His body reacted before his mind could catch up, launching him off the bench in one powerful motion. His coffee cup hit the ground and shattered. His instincts took over. His boots pounded the pavement, each step burning as he pushed his aging muscles beyond their limits. Faster, faster. Emily was still frozen in place. Her tiny hands curled into fists at her sides, her curls bouncing with each tiny, terrified breath. John wasn't going to make it in time. He reached for the closest object, a metal trash can, and with every ounce of strength left in his body, he threw it. The can flew through the air, spinning wildly before smashing into the bear's massive shoulder. It wasn't enough to hurt it, but it was enough to distract it. The bear's head snapped toward him, its deep-set eyes locking onto its new target. Emily blinked, her trance broken, and then she ran. Her father's voice, screaming her name, finally reached her. She turned on her heel and sprinted toward the crowd, her legs moving faster than they ever had before. John exhaled, but the bear wasn't done. Now it was looking at him. The beast let out a deep, guttural growl that sent chills down his spine. John had been in dangerous situations before. He'd faced enemies with rifles, had seen men drop in an instant from a single mistake. But this wasn't a battlefield, and he was unarmed. The bear reared up on its hind legs, towering over him, its claws gleaming in the morning light. John took a slow step back, his heart hammering. He needed a plan, and he needed one now. John Harris stood frozen as the massive Grizzly reared onto its hind legs, its full size towering over him. Its deep, rumbling growl vibrated through the air, sending a shiver down his spine. He had seen death before, had watched men die in the heat of battle, had felt the weight of choices that meant the difference between life and death. But this was different. This was raw, primal, and unstoppable. His hands clenched at his sides, fists tightening in a reflex he hadn't felt in years. The bear's black eyes locked onto him, intelligent and hungry, its nostrils flaring as it took in his scent. John had nothing, no weapon, no protection, no plan. He was standing in front of a predator that had just broken free, and now he was the only thing standing in its way. Behind him, screams still echoed through the zoo as families scrambled to escape. Parents clutched their children, employees fumbled with their radios, and security officers stood paralyzed, their useless pistols holstered at their sides. The crowd had created distance, but it wasn't far enough. If the bear made it past John, it would have open access to the entire zoo. The bear took a step forward. John didn't run. Every instinct in his body screamed for him to move, to sprint for cover, but years of training held him in place. He had learned long ago that fear would get you killed. The bear was watching him, waiting, gauging his reaction. He raised his arms slowly, making himself appear larger, his stance widening. He knew better than to turn his back. The second he ran, he was prey. The bear's ears flicked forward. It hesitated. John took the moment to step backward, his boots crunching against the pavement. His mind raced. He needed to get out of the bear's path without triggering its chase instinct. Then, the sound of movement to his right shattered the fragile standoff. A panicked teenager bolted from behind a bench, running for the nearest building. The bear's head snapped toward the sudden motion, its instincts flaring to life. The predator was back. The grizzly dropped to all fours, muscles tensing. It was going to charge. John had seconds. His eyes flicked across the scene, taking in everything at once. To his left, a fallen zookeeper was sprawled on the pavement, a tranquilizer rifle lying just inches from his outstretched hand. The weapon was too far for the employee to reach, but not for John. He lunged. The bear's roar shook the air as it burst forward. John hit the ground hard, his shoulder slamming into the concrete as his fingers closed around the rifle. He rolled, snapping the weapon up, just as the grizzly's massive paw swiped toward him. The world slowed. His finger found the trigger. The bear's claws sliced through the air. John fired. The dart embedded deep into the grizzly's side, sinking into thick muscle. But the bear didn't stop. It reared back, roaring in pain, its fury red-hot. The tranquilizer wouldn't work fast enough. John scrambled backward as the bear lashed out, its claws raking across the pavement inches from his leg. the air filled with the metallic scent of blood, and he realized it wasn't his. A security guard, foolish enough to step in, had taken the hit instead. The man crumpled to the ground, clutching his arm as blood poured between his fingers. John gritted his teeth, adrenaline surging. The bear was still moving, still deadly, and the tranquilizer wouldn't take full effect for at least another minute. He needed to buy time. John's mind worked fast. He spotted a metal supply cart tipped over near the gift shop, wheels spinning from where someone had knocked it down in the panic. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. John sprang to his feet, rushing for the cart. He gripped the handle and shoved with all his strength, sending it rolling directly into the bear's path. The grizzly snarled, momentarily distracted as the cart clattered against its legs. It wasn't enough to stop it, but it was enough to slow it. John turned on his heel and ran. He wasn't running away, he was leading it. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward the maintenance shed near the back of the zoo, a reinforced steel structure meant for storage. He needed to lure the bear somewhere enclosed, somewhere it could be contained. Behind him, the bear's heavy footsteps shook the ground, claws scraping against stone as it followed. The tranquilizer was working, but not fast enough. John pushed harder, his lungs burning. The door to the shed loomed ahead, just a few yards away. Then something slammed into his back. The world flipped. John hit the pavement hard, the air ripping from his lungs. His head snapped against the ground, pain exploding through his skull. The bear had swiped at him mid-run, clipping his shoulder with just enough force to send him sprawling. John gasped, his vision blurring. He tasted blood in his mouth. The bear loomed over him. His muscles refused to move, his body frozen from the impact. The grizzly exhaled, hot breath washing over him as it lowered its head. John knew he had seconds left. His fingers searched blindly across the ground, grasping for anything, and then a sound cut through the air. Cut through. Loud, sharp, echoing, the crack of a rifle. The bear shuddered. John forced his vision to focus. Standing near the zoo entrance, framed by the morning light, was a police officer. The man's rifle was still raised, the barrel smoking. John's breath caught. He recognized that stance, that aim, that level of precision. Whoever this cop was, he knew how to shoot. The bear let out a ragged snarl, its legs finally buckling as the sedatives in its bloodstream reached critical mass. And then the beast collapsed. The zoo fell silent. John exhaled slowly, his body trembling. The nightmare was over. He felt hands on him, lifting him, voices shouting orders. His vision swam, but he forced himself to focus. Emily. His eyes darted across the zoo, searching, and then he saw her. She was safe, wrapped in her father's arms, sobbing into his chest, but alive. Relief crashed over John like a tidal wave. He let his head fall back, the sky spinning above him. "Sir," a voice said, "can you stand?" John turned his head, his gaze landing on the police officer who had fired the final shot. The man had sharp features, an air of authority about him. His uniform was clean, but his stance told John everything he needed to know. This man had seen combat. John exhaled. He could stand, but something told him this was just the beginning. John Harris sat on the edge of the ambulance, a paramedic wrapping a bandage around his shoulder where the bear's claws had grazed him. The injury wasn't deep, but it burned like hell. His knuckles were scraped raw from the fall, his ribs ached from the impact, and his heart still pounded from the adrenaline crash, but none of that mattered. His eyes remained locked on the little girl in the distance, still clinging to her father's waist as if she might disappear if she let go. She was safe. That was the only thing that mattered. The zoo had become a scene of barely contained chaos. Police officers moved in controlled bursts, securing the area, directing the frightened crowd, and taping off the grizzly's enclosure. Zookeepers hovered around the sedated bear, their hands shaking as they confirmed it was still breathing. Parents huddled their children close, whispering reassurances they barely believed themselves. John noticed how many people were staring at him. The ones who had seen what he did, the ones who had watched him throw himself into the bear's path without a second thought. He wasn't used to being noticed, and he sure as hell wasn't used to being the center of attention. A shadow fell over him. "You okay?" John looked up, squinting against the midday sun. The cop who had fired the shot stood in front of him, his expression unreadable. He was tall, mid-40s, with close-cropped brown hair just starting to show signs of grey. His uniform was neatly pressed, his badge polished, but it was the way he carried himself that caught John's attention. He wasn't just a cop, he was someone who had been in the thick of it before. John recognized the stance, the awareness in his eyes, the way he hadn't hesitated when it came time to act. John wiped the blood from his bottom lip with the back of his hand. "I'll live." The cop studied him for a beat, then extended a hand. "Detective Cole Barrett, Fairhaven PD." John hesitated, then shook it. Barrett's grip was firm, steady. "You're ex-military," Barrett said, not a question. John met his gaze. "Yeah. Where?" John hesitated again. It had been a long time since he'd talked about it, and he didn't particularly like the memories. "Army," he said finally. "Ranger." Barrett nodded as if he had already guessed as much. "I was a Marine," he said. "Served in Iraq before I came home and put on the badge." That made sense. The precision, the calm, the ability to process danger without letting fear take over. Barrett crossed his arms. "You know, my men are trained for emergency situations, but what you did back there, most people wouldn't have reacted like that." John gave a one-shouldered shrug, wincing as the bandages pulled at his skin. "Didn't think about it," he said simply. "Just acted." "That's what I figured." Barrett exhaled, watching the last of the zookeepers load the tranquilized bear into a transport cage. The zoo director's gonna have a lot to answer for. A bear doesn't just walk out of its enclosure without some serious negligence. John followed his gaze. Lock was busted before the bear even touched it. Barrett's brow furrowed. "You saw it?" John nodded. "Right before everything went to hell. That lock wasn't secure. Somebody didn't do their job." Barrett muttered a curse under his breath. "Then this isn't just an accident." John didn't reply. He had spent his life assessing situations, spotting the smallest details that could mean the difference between life and death. Something about this didn't sit right. Barrett turned back to him. "You mind sticking around a little longer? I want to get your official statement, and frankly, I could use another set of eyes on this." John studied him for a moment. He hadn't planned on getting involved. He had spent the last few years keeping his head down, staying out of things that weren't his problem. But this wasn't just a simple accident. And besides, he had already thrown himself in the middle of it. "Yeah," John said finally, "I'll stick around." The zoo's security office was cramped, cluttered, and smelled faintly of stale coffee. A bank of monitors lined one wall, their screens showing grainy footage of the various enclosures. Barrett stood beside John, arms crossed, watching the grainy black-and-white playback of the moment the bear escaped. The footage wasn't great. The camera angle barely caught the enclosure's gate in the corner of the frame. But it was enough. John pointed at the screen. "There." Barrett leaned in. The timestamp showed just before the zoo opened. A shadowed figure approached the bear's gate. The footage was too blurry to make out details, but one thing was clear. The person wasn't a zookeeper. A few moments later, the figure walked away. The lock on the enclosure hung loose, and then, 20 minutes later, the bear pushed it open. Barrett exhaled sharply. "Well, shit." John glanced at him. "You recognizing that guy?" Barrett's jaw tightened. "Can't say for sure, but I have a feeling." John studied him. "You think this was intentional?" Barrett didn't answer right away. He rubbed a hand down his face, his fingers pressing into his temples. "This isn't the first time we've had trouble at the zoo," he admitted finally. "There have been reports of vandalism, locks tampered with, animals let out of their enclosures, but always small ones, nothing dangerous. This is the first time something like this has happened." John frowned. "Some kind of animal rights group?" Barrett shook his head. "No, this isn't protesters. Protesters want attention. They want their message heard. This, he gestured at the screen, this is something else. John crossed his arms. So what's the angle? Barrett sighed. That's what I need to find out. John leaned against the desk, considering. He had planned to go home after giving his statement, get back to his quiet life. But that gnawing feeling in his gut wouldn't go away. He knew what it meant. It meant there was more to this, and he wasn't the kind of man to walk away when something didn't add up. Barrett must have seen the look on his face, because he smirked slightly. "You're not the type to leave things alone, are you?" John snorted. "No, I guess I'm not," Barrett nodded. "Good, because I could use someone who sees things the way you do." John studied him for a moment. Then finally, he gave a small nod. Looks like he wasn't done with this town just yet. John Harris had seen his fair share of trouble in the world, but nothing about this sat right with him. A loose lock, a grizzly bear on the loose, and a shadowy figure caught on grainy security footage. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose, and that meant they weren't done. The zoo had been evacuated, police officers securing the entrances, while staff members scrambled to take stock of the damage. The bear was unconscious in the transport cage, a team of specialists checking its vitals before it could be returned to a reinforced holding area. But John wasn't looking at the bear anymore. He was looking at the people. Panic had left the visitors shaken. Their voices hushed as they huddled in small groups near the parking lot. Parents held their children tight, zookeepers whispered among themselves, and officers moved back and forth, keeping order. But there were too many people, too many moving parts. Whoever had done this could still be here. Barrett stood beside him, arms crossed, scanning the same crowd with sharp eyes. "You thinking what I'm thinking?" John asked. Barrett's jaw tightened. If the guy who tampered with that lock is still here, he's watching all of this unfold. John nodded slowly. And if he's watching, he's got a reason. He wants to see the fallout. They exchanged a look, unspoken understanding passing between them. John's instinct screamed at him to move. Without another word, he peeled away from Barrett and made his way toward the crowd. He wasn't a cop, never had been, never wanted to be. But he knew how to hunt. He knew how to read people, how to spot the one person who didn't fit. He moved slowly, scanning faces, watching body language. Most people looked scared. Some looked annoyed, impatient to leave. Then he saw him. A man standing just outside the main group, half hidden behind a family pretending to check his phone, but barely looking at the screen. His posture was too stiff, his eyes flicking around too quickly. Unlike the others, there was no fear in his expression, just calculation. John angled himself casually, pretending to be just another bystander. His years of training kicked in. Watch the target without looking like you're watching. Don't move too fast. The man turned his head slightly, and John caught a glimpse of his face. Mid-30s, thin, pale skin, sunken eyes, shaggy blonde hair. Something about him felt off. Then just as John took a step closer, the man moved. He turned sharply and bolted. John didn't think. He ran. "Hey!" Barrett shouted, instantly reacting, sprinting after them. The suspect shoved past a group of onlookers, sending a woman stumbling backward. He darted between parked cars, his sneakers slamming against the pavement as he raced toward the exit. John pushed harder, ignoring the pain in his ribs, his body remembering the feeling of a chase all too well. His boots hit the ground in long, measured strides, gaining on the man with every step. The suspect reached the edge of the parking lot, skidding onto the main road. Then he made his mistake. He looked back. John surged forward. In one motion, he grabbed the back of the man's jacket and yanked. The suspect let out a startled yelp as John spun him around and slammed him against the nearest car. "Where the hell you think you're going?" John growled. The man struggled, but John had years of training and 100 pounds of muscle on him. He twisted the suspect's arm behind his back just as Barrett arrived, breathless but steady. Barrett pulled his cuffs free. "Nice catch!" John shoved the man toward him and shoved the... "Don't thank me yet." The suspect was breathing hard, his chest rising and falling, but he wasn't panicking. He wasn't shouting for a lawyer, wasn't demanding to be let go. He was smiling. Barrett frowned. "You think this is funny?" The man tilted his head. You have no idea what's coming." Something in John's gut twisted. Barrett grabbed him by the arm and hauled him toward the squad car. "Yeah? Well, let's see how funny you think jail is." The suspect didn't resist. He let himself be cuffed, let himself be shoved into the back of the vehicle. But that smile never faded. John exhaled slowly, watching as Barrett shut the door and called in backup. The whole thing had been too easy. This guy wasn't nervous. He wasn't acting like someone who had just been caught red-handed. That meant one of two things. Either he was too stupid to realize what kind of trouble he was in, or he wasn't the one they should be worried about. John turned back toward the zoo. Something was wrong. He scanned the area again, eyes moving over the enclosures, the parking lot, the security office. People were still scattered, talking in hushed voices. A few officers were questioning the zookeepers. Others were reviewing the security footage. Everything seemed under control. But John knew better than to trust appearances. He walked over to one of the employees, a young woman in a Fairhaven zoo polo shirt, who had been standing near the entrance, rubbing her arms. "You work here?" he asked. She looked up, startled. Yeah, I'm Megan." John nodded toward the transport cage. "That bear, was he the only one in that enclosure?" She blinked, confused by the question. Yeah, he's the only grizzly we have. Why?" John's stomach turned to stone. The only one. So then why? A sound cut through the air, a loud, piercing cry of alarm. Not from a human, from an animal. John's head snapped toward the far side of the zoo, and that's when he saw it. A second enclosure, a second broken lock, and this time it wasn't a bear. It was a lion. A fully grown male, golden mane shimmering in the afternoon sun, standing at the edge of its now open cage. John barely had time to react before the lion leapt over the low barrier and disappeared into the trees. The zoo wasn't safe yet, not even close. Barrett cursed. "Tell me that didn't just happen." John clenched his jaw. "We've got a bigger problem." Barrett grabbed his radio, barking orders. "We've got another breach. Lion is loose. I repeat, lion is loose in the zoo. Lock this place down now." The officers around them snapped into action, the controlled chaos of the first escape now surging into a full-blown crisis. But John wasn't thinking about the officers. He was thinking about the families still inside, the parents, the children, and one little girl in particular. His eyes darted through the panicked crowd, searching for the bouncing curls he had seen earlier. Emily, she was still here, and now she was in danger all over again. John took a breath. His body ached, his muscles were screaming, but he pushed it all aside. Because if no one else was going to stop this, he would. Again. John Harris moved before his mind had fully processed what he was seeing. The lion's massive form disappeared into the dense tree line that bordered the zoo's walking paths, its golden mane catching the last slivers of sunlight before it was swallowed by the shadows. The moment felt surreal, time slowing, instincts flaring. But there was no time to think. Barrett was already shouting into his radio. His voice sharp. "All units, lock down the zoo now. We have a second loose animal, adult male lion. I repeat, a lion is loose in the zoo." Panic rippled through the remaining crowd. The ones who had lingered after the bear attack, either too stunned or too stubborn to leave, were now realizing that whatever disaster they had narrowly escaped was far from over. Screams cut through the air again, parents scooping up their children, running toward the exits. John didn't look at them. His eyes were locked on the thick patch of trees where the lion had disappeared. He scanned the ground, tracking instinct kicking in, looking for movement, for a rustle in the undergrowth, for the telltale flicker of golden fur in the fading light. Then his stomach clenched. Emily. He had seen her father carrying her toward the parking lot earlier, but had they made it out in time? John turned sharply, his eyes sweeping over the zoo entrance. The crowd had thinned, but a handful of people still lingered, employees struggling to follow emergency protocol. A few officers ushering people toward the gates, and then he spotted them. David Dawson, clutching Emily tightly, standing near the souvenir shop, arguing with a zoo employee. The little girl was crying, her small fists curled into her father's jacket. Too close, too damn close to the trees. John was already moving before he realized it. He cut through the crowd, dodging a fleeing teenager and sidestepping a woman who nearly barreled into him. He reached the father and daughter in seconds, his voice sharp. "You need to move, now." David turned, startled. His face was pale, his hands gripping his daughter as if she might disappear. I was trying to get my car, but they blocked the parking lot," and John grabbed his arm, his voice low but urgent. "Forget the car. Get to the police. Get out of the zoo." David hesitated for half a second too long. A sound cut through the air, low, deep, rumbling, not a roar, not yet. Or just a growl, a warning. John turned his head slowly, his body stiff. The lion stood at the edge of the trees, its golden eyes locked onto them, its massive frame partially hidden by the undergrowth. Its ears were pricked forward, its muscles coiled, its tail flicking in slow, deliberate motions. Hunting? John knew animals. This wasn't a scared lion. It wasn't confused. It was stalking. His hand tightened on David's arm. He didn't take his eyes off the lion as he spoke, his voice calm but absolute. "Walk. Do not run. Take your daughter and go. Now." David swallowed hard. He didn't argue this time. He held Emily tighter, turned, and moved, slowly, carefully. His steps were uneven, but he was doing exactly what John told him. John stayed put. The lion's gaze followed the movement. John's heart pounded, but he forced his breathing to stay steady. Running wasn't an option, neither was freezing. He had to be something else. A presence, something to hold the animal's attention. The lion took a step forward, then another. John's mind raced. He was unarmed, just like with the bear. No weapon, no defense. If the tranquilizer team wasn't fast enough, if the police weren't close enough, he'd have to stop this himself. He shifted his weight, widening his stance, making himself seem larger. It was a trick that sometimes worked with predators. Sometimes. The lion hesitated. Its eyes flicked between John and the retreating father and daughter. Then, in the distance, an engine revved. Too loud, too sudden. The lion's head snapped toward the noise. Then it lunged. John barely had time to react before the massive animal sprang forward. His body moved on instinct. He grabbed the nearest object, a trash bin, and flung it directly into the lion's path. The bin crashed into the ground, metal rattling, garbage spilling across the pavement. The lion skidded, claws scraping against the pavement, narrowly missing John as it veered sideways. John pivoted, moving fast, trying to put distance between them. The lion was faster. It recovered instantly, whirling to face him, muscles rippling beneath its sleek fur. Its ears pinned back. This time there was no hesitation. It attacked. John barely managed to dodge. He twisted to the side, the lion's paw swiping just inches from his ribs. He staggered back, but there was nowhere to go. The fence behind him blocked his escape. His mind raced. No weapon, no cover, no plan. And then a gunshot. The lion flinched, its body jolting as a bullet struck the pavement near its feet. John's head snapped toward the source. Barrett. The detective stood a few yards away, his service weapon raised, his stance firm. The lion snarled, its ears flicking at the sudden noise. It took a few steps back, growling. John exhaled sharply, pushing himself off the fence, his body tense. Barrett didn't take his eyes off the animal as he spoke. "You all right?" John rolled his shoulder. "Been better." Barrett adjusted his grip on the gun, his voice low. "We don't want to kill it." "I know." John's eyes flicked toward the tranquilizer team. They were moving fast, darting around the enclosures, weapons raised. But they weren't close enough. The lion took another step forward, its golden eyes narrowing. John's mind worked fast. The trash bin had worked before. He needed something else. Then he saw it. A fire extinguisher. A few feet to his right, mounted on a pole. John took a slow step. The lion's gaze locked onto him again, its tail flicking. He had seconds. One more step, then another. He reached out. Fingers curled around cold metal. The lion tensed. John ripped the extinguisher free, aimed, and squeezed the trigger. A blast of white foam erupted into the air, hissing loudly, filling the space between him and the lion with a thick, blinding cloud. The lion recoiled, snarling, shaking its head as the spray hit its face. John didn't hesitate. He moved. Barrett fired another shot, into the ground this time, another warning. The lion growled, stepping backward, its movement slower now, more uncertain, and then a sharp thwop. The tranquilizer dart struck. The lion's muscles twitched. Its breathing slowed. John exhaled, his heart hammering in his chest. The lion took 2 more sluggish steps before its legs gave out. It collapsed. The zoo was silent again. John let out a breath, his grip loosening on the extinguisher. Barrett lowered his weapon, glancing over. "You always pull insane stunts like that?" John smirked, his pulse still racing. "Only when I have to." The tranquilizer team rushed in, securing the animal, checking its vitals. John turned, scanning the area. David and Emily were gone, safe. The danger had passed. But deep in his gut, John knew something. This wasn't over. Whoever had done this wasn't just trying to cause chaos. They were testing something. And John intended to find out what. John Harris sat on the hood of an abandoned zoo cart, his breath finally evening out as the last remnants of adrenaline faded from his system. The lion was down, its powerful frame rising and falling with the slow rhythm of sedation, surrounded by cautious zookeepers and police officers. It would be transported back to a secure holding area, just like the bear before it. The zoo was officially closed, the exits locked, visitors long gone. But something still wasn't right. John could feel it. His eyes scanned the scene, his instincts still on high alert despite the calming voices around him. The employees were shaken but moving with urgency. The officers were debriefing, their radios chattering in bursts of static and clipped commands. The tranquilizer team finished loading the lion onto a transport truck, the tension in the air slowly diffusing. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it felt like a warning. Barrett was standing a few feet away, speaking into his radio, his face unreadable as he relayed updates to the dispatch center. When he finally clicked it off, he exhaled and turned toward John. "We got lucky," he muttered. John scoffed, rubbing the ache in his shoulder. "I don't believe in luck." Barrett nodded like he expected that answer. He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "This wasn't random. The first time, maybe. A faulty lock. Sloppy work, bad luck, but 2 enclosures. That's deliberate." John kept his gaze on the lion, watching its slow, drugged breathing. "The guy I chased down," he said. "He was watching the crowd, not the animals. He wasn't surprised when the bear got out. He was waiting for it." Barrett's jaw tightened. That's what I was afraid of." He let out a frustrated breath and ran a hand through his hair. "We've had incidents at the zoo before. Vandalism, a few break-ins, but nothing this calculated." John's thoughts drifted back to the blurry security footage, the shadowy figure unlocking the bear's gate before disappearing into the trees. "Who owns this place?" he asked. Barrett frowned. "The zoo?" John nodded. Barrett glanced around, lowering his voice. "Technically, it's a city-run facility, funded by local and state grants, private donors. There's a board of directors, but day-to-day operations fall under the zoo director, a guy named Paul Redman." John studied Barrett's face. "You don't like him?" "I don't trust him." Barrett sighed, glancing toward the main office. "He's been running the place for years, but it's no secret he's been struggling to keep it funded. There's been talk of budget cuts, shutting the place down, maybe selling the land." John narrowed his eyes. "Selling it to who?" Barrett hesitated. John pressed. "If the zoo disappears, someone profits. Who?" Barrett let out a slow breath. "A development group. Out-of-town investors looking to turn this area into something bigger. Shopping centers, high-end condos, the usual. The land's worth a fortune. But as long as the zoo stands, it's off limits." John's mind pieced it together. "So someone makes sure the zoo doesn't stand." Barrett nodded grimly. "Exactly." John exhaled, his gut tightening. This wasn't just about animals getting loose. It was about money, control. Someone wanted the zoo gone, and they weren't above using chaos to make it happen. Barrett straightened. I need to talk to Redman, get his take. He might be a terrible administrator, but I don't think he'd sabotage his own zoo. He glanced at John. You up for sitting in on this? John smirked. I think I've already got my hands dirty. Might as well see it through. They made their way to the zoo's administrative offices, a small brick building near the back of the property. A handful of employees were already gathered outside, their faces pale, their hands gripping coffee cups like lifelines. The tension was palpable. Inside, the air was stale with stress and old paperwork. Paul Redman sat behind his cluttered desk, his tie loosened, sweat forming at his temples. He looked like a man who had just survived a firing squad, and in a way, he had. Barrett didn't waste time. Mr. Redman, we need answers. 2 animals escaped today. That's not an accident. Redman swallowed, adjusting his glasses. I don't know what to tell you. I had no idea there was a security issue. The enclosures are supposed to be checked daily. We have protocols. John crossed his arms. Then someone inside your operation isn't following them. Redman hesitated, glancing toward the window as if searching for an escape. Barrett leaned forward. Paul, I need you to be honest with me. Have you received any threats? Has anyone approached you about selling this place? Redman wiped his forehead. Yes. There have been offers. John felt his pulse tick up. Redman continued, his voice shaky. A few months ago, I started getting messages, emails, someone telling me that the zoo wasn't sustainable, that it was a waste of city money. Then the break-ins started. Someone vandalized the reptile house, cut power to the bird enclosures. I reported it, but nothing ever came of it. Barrett cursed under his breath. Why didn't you say anything? Redman laughed bitterly. Say what? That I'm in charge of a sinking ship? That I'm failing to keep this place running? You think City Hall wants to hear that? They're already looking for an excuse to pull the plug. John watched him carefully. The guy was scared. Whether it was fear of failure or something worse, John couldn't tell. But he was holding something back. John stepped forward. Who approached you? Redman hesitated. Barrett's voice was sharp. Paul. Redman exhaled. There's a company, Martech Development, out of Chicago. They've been pushing for this land for over a year. They want to build a shopping center and a luxury apartment complex. They've already secured property nearby, but the zoo is in the way. They've sent reps to city meetings, pushing for rezoning. They've donated to political campaigns, greased the right wheels. John's gut tightened. And you think they're behind this? Redman swallowed. I don't know. But I do know that ever since I refused to negotiate, the problems have gotten worse. Barrett's expression darkened. We need to find out who's pulling the strings. John nodded. And fast. Because if this was a test run, whoever did this isn't done. Before Redman could respond, Barrett's radio crackled. Detective, we've got something. A witness near the west parking lot saw a man messing with one of the gates before the lion got out. We're pulling footage now. Barrett straightened. On our way. John glanced at Redman. Stay put. Lock the doors. Redman nodded, looking more exhausted than ever. John and Barrett stepped outside. The cool evening air a stark contrast to the heat still burning in John's chest. Barrett's jaw was clenched. This is bigger than I thought. John adjusted his cap, his mind racing. So what's the next move? Barrett exhaled. We track down the guy who did this, and then we find out who sent him. John nodded slowly. And when we do, Barrett's eyes darkened. We shut it down. John glanced back at the zoo, now eerily quiet in the fading light. This wasn't over. Not even close. John Harris followed Barrett through the dimly lit corridors of the security office, the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and stress. The room was cluttered with overstuffed file cabinets, a cheap metal desk, and a wall lined with grainy security monitors. The zoo's control center, if you could even call it that, was woefully outdated, a relic of an era when crime was an afterthought in a quiet town like Fairhaven. A uniformed officer was already reviewing the newly retrieved security footage on the central monitor. The image flickered, showing a timestamp from just before the lion's escape. "There," the officer muttered, pointing to a shadowy figure near the west enclosure. John stepped closer, his eyes narrowing as the figure moved along the fence, crouching low, avoiding the camera's main angles. It was the same silhouette from the bear's enclosure footage, same lean frame, same cautious movements. The person knew the cameras were there, knew exactly how to avoid them. "Pause it," Barrett ordered. The officer froze the frame just as the suspect turned slightly, catching the light from a nearby street lamp. The resolution was garbage, but it was enough. John clenched his jaw. The guy from the parking lot. The one who had smiled when they caught him. Barrett muttered a curse under his breath. "Son of a bitch!" John exhaled slowly. So he wasn't just watching. He was working. Barrett nodded. "And the fact that he let us catch him? That means he's just a small piece of the puzzle. He wasn't worried because he knew someone else was pulling the strings." John's gut twisted. He had spent his career recognizing when things didn't add up, when there were too many missing pieces to make sense of the picture. This whole situation screamed setup. The uniformed officer cleared his throat. "You want me to bring him in for questioning again?" Barrett didn't answer immediately. He looked at John instead. "What do you think?" John knew what he was really asking. The old way or the official way? John sighed. He's not going to talk in an interrogation room. If he's working for someone higher up, he's already been told to keep his mouth shut. Pressure him too hard, he'll lawyer up. Barrett folded his arms. "So, what's the play?" John watched the grainy image of the suspect on the screen, the way he moved, the way he took his time. This wasn't some random thug looking for a thrill. This was methodical, precise. "He thinks he's untouchable," John murmured. "He thinks he's just another face in the crowd." Barrett nodded, catching on. "So we shake that confidence." John cracked his knuckles. "We make him realize he's a lot more alone than he thought." The holding cells at Fairhaven PD were about as unimpressive as John had expected. Small, outdated, more of a formality than a real deterrent for crime, in a town where the biggest offense was usually a drunken bar fight. The suspect, Derek Lane, according to his ID, sat on the hard bench, his arms resting lazily on his knees. The same smug grin was still on his face, though there was a flicker of curiosity when he saw John and Barrett walk in together. "Back so soon," Derek mused, his voice casual. "I was just getting comfortable." Barrett leaned against the doorframe, arms crossed. "You had an interesting day, Derek." Derek smirked. "Oh yeah? Guess I missed it." John stepped forward, pulling up a chair and flipping it around before sitting down, his arms resting against the chair's back. He studied Derek, letting the silence stretch. Derek shifted slightly, but his smirk remained. John finally spoke. "We know it was you." Derek tilted his head. "I don't know what you're talking about." John sighed. "See, that's the thing. If this were just about the bear, maybe we'd think it was some dumb stunt. Maybe you'd get off easy. But then came the lion." Barrett stepped forward, his voice sharp. "2 enclosures, 2 sabotaged locks, and we've got you on camera at both of them." Derek chuckled. "Sounds like you've got it all figured out. So, what do you need me for?" John leaned in, lowering his voice. "Because we both know you're not the brains behind this." That got a reaction. It was small, a flicker in his expression, a slight tensing of his jaw. But John caught it. Derek exhaled, still playing the part. "If I had $1 for every time some cop tried the 'you're just a pawn' routine, I wouldn't be sitting here." John smirked. "That's just it, though. You are a pawn. You think they give a damn about you? The second things go south, you're nothing but collateral damage." Derek's smile faltered. Barrett pressed the advantage. "Here's how this goes, Derek. We're going to find out who's paying you, whether you talk or not. But if you do talk, maybe things go easier for you. Maybe you don't take the full hit for this." Derek swallowed but recovered quickly, shaking his head. "You guys are cute, really, but you've got nothing." John studied him for a long moment, then stood up. He turned to Barrett. "He's wasting our time." Barrett nodded, playing along. "Yeah, let's go." They both moved toward the door. Derek hesitated. John counted the seconds in his head. 5, 4, 3. "I didn't do anything wrong." John turned back. "No? Then why are you still talking?" Derek scowled. "I'm just saying, hypothetically, maybe I was paid to be there. That doesn't mean I did anything." Barrett raised an eyebrow. "Paid by who?" Derek hesitated again. John gave him a slow nod. "You can either tell us now or watch the guys who paid you walk free while you take the fall." Derek licked his lips. He was starting to crack, but he wasn't there yet. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "There's a guy," he muttered. "Middleman. Name's Carson Holt. He's the one handing out the jobs. I don't know who's above him, but he's been sniffing around town for months." John exchanged a look with Barrett. Barrett nodded. "Where do we find him?" Derek leaned back, his eyes darting to the ceiling, as if debating whether or not to dig himself in deeper. Finally, he sighed. "There's a bar, Hunter's Ridge, outside of town, past the industrial park. He's got connections there." John nodded, stepping back. "See? That wasn't so hard." Derek shook his head, his smile returning, though it didn't quite reach his eyes this time. "You guys don't get it, do you? This thing is bigger than you think. The people behind it, they don't leave loose ends." Barrett crossed his arms. "Then I'd say you've got a problem." Derek exhaled sharply, rubbing his face. "You don't know the half of it." John exchanged a final glance with Barrett before stepping out of the room. The moment the door closed behind them, Barrett exhaled. "Carson Holt," John nodded. "We find him, we find out who's pulling the strings." Barrett smirked. "Feel like taking a ride?" John cracked his knuckles. "Thought you'd never ask." They walked down the hall without another word. The real hunt was about to begin. Hunter's Ridge sat on the outskirts of Fairhaven, far from the clean streets and quiet neighborhoods, buried deep past the industrial park, where streetlights were scarce and the roads were more potholes than pavement. It wasn't the kind of place where strangers were welcome. It was the kind of place where trouble found you, whether you were looking for it or not. John Harris and Detective Cole Barrett sat in Barrett's unmarked police car just outside the parking lot, the bar's flickering neon sign barely illuminating the half-dozen motorcycles lined up near the entrance. The parking lot was full of battered pickups, a few blacked-out sedans, and one SUV with tinted windows that made John's gut tighten. "That's a cartel vehicle," Barrett muttered, his fingers tapping the steering wheel. John nodded. "And that means our guy isn't just some low-level errand boy. If Holt's in there meeting with cartel players, this goes way beyond chasing out a failing zoo." Barrett exhaled, staring at the bar. "You want to tell me what the hell kind of town I've been policing? Because I thought we had problems with budget cuts and drunks fighting over parking spots, not cartel-backed real estate takeovers?" John smirked. "Looks like your town's grown up." Barrett sighed. "Yeah. Well, I liked it better when we were small." He reached for his gun, checking the magazine before holstering it. "How do you want to play this?" John glanced at the entrance. Two guys stood near the door, both built like bouncers, though they weren't there to check IDs. They were there to make sure the wrong people didn't walk inside. "We're not cops," John said. Barrett shot him a look. "I am." John smirked. "Not tonight, you're not." Barrett rolled his eyes but nodded. "Fine. We're just two guys looking for a drink." "Exactly." John pushed open the car door, stepping out into the cool night air. Barrett followed, adjusting his jacket to keep his badge covered. They walked toward the entrance at a steady pace. Not too fast, not too slow. The trick to places like this wasn't to look like you belonged. It was to look like you didn't care whether you did or not. One of the guys at the door straightened as they approached. "Private event." John stopped just short of the steps. "Didn't see a sign." The guy smirked. "You don't need one. If you're not on the list, you don't walk in." Barrett tilted his head. "Funny. I didn't know a place like this had a list." The second guy crossed his arms. "It does now." John sighed, cracking his neck. He had spent enough time in places like this to know how these things went. They could talk in circles for another 10 minutes, or they could move straight to the part where someone got hurt. so he picked option 2. His fist snapped forward, catching the first guy under the jaw. The man stumbled back, hitting the wall, his knees buckling. Before the second guy could react, John pivoted, driving his elbow into his throat. The man choked, staggering, reaching for something at his waist. Barrett stepped in, grabbing the guy's wrist before he could pull whatever weapon he was going for. He twisted, and the man let out a sharp grunt as the gun clattered to the ground. The first guy tried to push off the wall, shaking his head to clear the hit. John didn't let him. He slammed him back against the wood, pinning him with one forearm. "We clear now." The man gritted his teeth, his hands balled into fists, but he didn't reach for anything. He had enough sense to know when a fight wasn't worth it. Barrett exhaled. "Appreciate your hospitality." They stepped over the groaning men and pushed through the door. Inside, the bar smelled like spilled beer, cheap cologne, and bad decisions. The crowd was loud but watchful, a mix of locals, bikers, and men who looked like they had spent time on the wrong side of prison walls. A few heads turned as John and Barrett entered, but no one said anything. They made their way toward the back, scanning the booths, the bar, the exits. Then John spotted him. Carson Holt. He was sitting in a booth near the back, his arms stretched across the top of the seat, talking to 2 men in dark suits. The cartel players. His body language was cocky, but John could see the way his fingers twitched against the seat. Nervous. He should be. John and Barrett approached the booth. One of the suited men looked up first, his dark eyes narrowing. "You're interrupting," he said in a thick accent. Barrett ignored him. He looked directly at Holt. "You and I need to have a chat." Holt smirked, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Do we?" John grabbed an empty chair and flipped it around, sitting down, mirroring Holt's earlier position. "Yeah, we do." The second cartel guy, a man with a shaved head and a scar running from his ear to his chin, shifted in his seat. "We're in the middle of a meeting," John shrugged, "so reschedule." Holt's smirk faded. He glanced at the 2 men, then back at John and Barrett. "You 2 have no idea what you're walking into." Barrett leaned forward. "I think we do. You're taking orders from people who want the zoo gone. And today, that plan escalated. 2 animals got loose. That's not an accident." Holt exhaled through his nose. "That's not my problem." John tilted his head. "See, that's the part that's not adding up. You work for Martech Development, right? Real estate, land acquisitions, all that clean, respectable business stuff. But here you are, in a bar full of criminals, making deals with guys who smuggle people across the border. That's a big leap from selling condos." Holt tensed. Barrett smiled coldly. "So tell me, Holt, what's worth getting in bed with the cartel?" Holt's lips pressed into a thin line. His eyes flicked to the men beside him, calculating. Then he made his move. His hand darted under the table. John reacted instantly. He grabbed Holt's wrist, slamming it against the table. A switchblade clattered to the floor. The first cartel guy reached for something under his jacket. Barrett pulled his gun. "Don't!" The tension snapped into place, thick and heavy. The bar had gone quiet. John leaned in, his voice low. "Tell me what's going on, Holt, or I'll let my friend here take you in, and you can explain it to people who don't have patience for real estate deals gone bad." Holt swallowed hard. His eyes darted to the cartel guys again. He was trying to decide who scared him more. Finally, he exhaled sharply. "Martech doesn't just want the zoo gone. They want the land cleared. Completely. No lawsuits, no protests. They needed people to be afraid to go near it." Barrett's grip on his gun tightened. "So they turned to the cartel." Holt nodded. "They're paying them to escalate, drive the fear up, make the city desperate to get rid of it." John's stomach turned. "And what happens next?" Holt hesitated. Then he muttered, "Next, they make sure something happens that shuts it down for good." Barrett's eyes darkened. "Something bigger than a couple of loose animals." Holt didn't answer. He didn't have to. John and Barrett exchanged a glance. The zoo wasn't just a target, it was a time bomb, and whoever was behind it was getting ready to light the fuse. John Harris could feel the weight of Holt's words pressing down on him. He had spent his life reading people, and Holt wasn't lying. Whatever was coming next wasn't just another broken lock or another animal let loose. It was something designed to end the zoo completely. The cartel men were watching, their expressions unreadable, their hands too close to their jackets. Barrett still had his gun out, but the tension in the bar was shifting. A few of the other patrons had started moving, subtly repositioning themselves, like they were waiting for an excuse to jump in. John glanced at Holt. "If you know what's coming, now's the time to say it." Holt swallowed hard, his hands clenching against the table. "I don't know the details," he admitted. "I was just a middleman, passed along the payments, made sure the right people got what they needed. But the last thing I heard, they're done playing around. No more slow burns. They want this over fast." John didn't like that answer. Define over fast. Holt hesitated, but the flicker of real fear in his eyes told John everything he needed to know. "If I had to guess, a fire, an explosion, something big enough to make sure the place never reopens." Barrett swore under his breath. "When?" Holt shook his head. "I don't know. Could be tomorrow, could be tonight." That was all John needed to hear. He stood up fast, knocking his chair back, his muscles already coiling for action. "We need to go." Barrett backed up toward the door, his gun still raised. "Holt, you're coming with us." The cartel men didn't move, but their silence was heavy, dangerous. They weren't going to stop them now. Not here, but John knew they'd be watching. Holt looked between them and the cartel guys, his breathing shallow. He had just made himself a loose end, and loose ends didn't last long. John didn't wait for him to decide. He grabbed Holt by the collar and yanked him up. "Move!" They made it to the door, out into the cool night air. But John's instincts were already screaming. They were being watched. Barrett shoved Holt toward the car. "Get in! Now!" John scanned the parking lot. The SUV with the tinted windows was still there, but the engine was running now. A second later, the driver's door opened. John tensed. A man stepped out, dressed in dark jeans and a fitted jacket, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't just another thug. He had the presence of someone who had done this before, someone who was used to people being afraid of him. Barrett muttered, "Shit." The man's eyes flicked to Holt, then back to John and Barrett. His expression was calm, almost amused. "You're making a mistake." His voice was smooth, measured. "You don't want to get involved in this." John held his ground. "Already am." The man's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't think you understand. You walk away now, you go home, you forget you ever heard any of this. You live. You don't? Well." He gestured vaguely toward the darkness. "People disappear all the time," Barrett scoffed. "Yeah. See, the thing about threats is they only work on people who scare easy." The man's expression didn't change, but something in his stance did. He wasn't used to people not backing down. John's patience was running out. "Tell your bosses they're running out of time." The man studied him for a long moment. Then he gave a slow nod, like he was filing the conversation away for later. Without another word, he turned and got back in his SUV. A second later, the vehicle pulled out of the parking lot and disappeared into the night. Barrett exhaled. That guy's going to be a problem. John didn't take his eyes off the spot where the SUV had vanished. "Not if we end this first." They drove back toward the station, Holt silent in the back seat, his face pale. He had burned his bridges, and he knew it. Barrett kept his hands tight on the wheel. "If they're planning an attack, we need to move fast." John nodded. "They'll want to hit it when there's no one around. Late night? Early morning?" Barrett's phone buzzed. He glanced at it, his frown deepening. "Dispatch just got a report of a break-in at the zoo." John's stomach dropped. "They're already moving." Barrett floored it. The tires screeched as they took the turn toward the zoo, the engine growling as the speedometer climbed. The streets were mostly empty now, the town already settling in for the night, but the tension in the car was thick. Holt finally spoke. "You think it's them?" John glanced back. "I think you already know the answer." Holt didn't argue. They reached the zoo in minutes, the front gate standing open, one of the metal locks cut clean through. John was out of the car before it fully stopped. Barrett followed, drawing his weapon. They moved in fast, cutting through the entrance, past the darkened visitor center toward the animal enclosures. The night was too quiet. No sirens yet, no backup. John's instincts flared. They weren't dealing with amateurs. Barrett whispered into his radio, "Units en route. Be advised, possible multiple suspects." John signaled for him to stay low as they approached the main pathway. Then he saw it. Movement near the maintenance shed. Two figures, both dressed in dark clothing, working fast. One of them was pouring liquid along the edge of the wooden structure. The other was crouched by the electrical panel, a small device in his hands. John's blood went cold. An accelerant and a detonator. He didn't think. He moved. His boots barely made a sound as he closed the distance. The man with the detonator didn't see him coming. John grabbed him by the back of the neck and slammed his face into the metal panel. The man grunted, his body jerking, but John was already twisting the detonator out of his grip. The second man turned, startled, reaching for something in his jacket. Barrett fired a warning shot. "Don't!" he snapped. The man hesitated. John forced the first guy to the ground, pinning his arm behind his back. "You light this place up? You think it just goes away? You think people stop looking?" The man coughed, spitting blood onto the pavement. "You don't know who you're messing with." John leaned in. "Neither do you." More sirens, more voices. Backup was coming. The second man dropped his weapon and raised his hands. Barrett stepped closer. "Smart move." John let out a slow breath, his pulse still hammering. They had stopped it, this time, but something gnawed at him. This had been rushed, sloppy. They weren't the real players. This was a distraction. John looked toward the other side of the zoo, where the real damage could already be done. Then he heard it, a low, distant boom, not an explosion, something worse. The sound of gates breaking open, more than one. Barrett's radio crackled. Dispatch's voice was tense. "We've got multiple enclosures breached. I repeat, multiple animals loose." John's grip on the collar of the man beneath him tightened. The zoo wasn't just under attack. It had just become a war zone. The radio in Barrett's hand crackled again. The dispatcher's voice strained. "Confirmed breaches in multiple enclosures. Officers on site report multiple large animals unaccounted for." John Harris had spent enough time in war zones to know when a situation was about to spiral into complete chaos. The explosion hadn't come, but the damage was just as bad. Someone had released the animals, all of them. Barrett swore under his breath, gripping his gun tighter as he looked at the two men they had caught. The one John had pinned to the ground let out a wet cough, a smirk curling his bloodied lip. "Too late," he muttered. John ignored him. His focus was already shifting to the sounds in the distance. The unmistakable clang of metal gates swinging open, the echo of hoofbeats on pavement, the deep guttural growls that sent a chill through his bones. He met Barrett's eyes. "You hear that?" Barrett nodded grimly. "Yeah, I hear it." John shoved the man beneath him face first into the dirt and stood. "We need to move." Barrett barely had time to nod before a scream cut through the night, not from the police radio, not from the men they had caught, from inside the zoo. A human scream. John didn't hesitate. His boots pounded against the pavement as he sprinted toward the sound. Barrett was right behind him, his gun up, scanning the area as they ran. The pathways were eerily dark, the overhead lamps flickering, some shattered completely. Whoever had set this up had thought of everything. The zoo wasn't just being sabotaged, it was being turned into a trap. Then, up ahead, John saw movement, a lone security guard. His uniform ripped, stumbling backward toward a locked service gate. His eyes were wild, his breath coming in frantic gasps. He was fumbling for his radio, but his hands were shaking too much to work the button. And behind him, a pair of golden eyes reflected the dim light. A jaguar. John didn't stop to think. He reached for the closest object, a metal trash lid that had been knocked over in the chaos, and launched it forward. The clattering sound was enough. The jaguar flinched, its ears twitching at the sudden noise. John seized the opening, closing the distance fast. "Move!" he barked at the guard. The man barely registered him before John grabbed his arm and yanked him to the side, putting himself between the guard and the predator. The jaguar hesitated, assessing, its muscles tensed, ready to pounce. John held his ground. He kept his stance wide, his breathing slow. Barrett skidded to a stop beside him, raising his weapon. "Hold!" John said sharply. Barrett didn't lower his gun, but he didn't fire either. The jaguar growled low in its throat. John had seen this before, not with a jaguar, but with wolves, with mountain lions. Predators didn't waste energy on fights they weren't sure they could win. He took a slow step forward. The jaguar tensed. Another step. The jaguar let out a soft chuff, a warning. John stared it down. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, the jaguar turned. Silent. Fluid. It disappeared into the shadows, melting back into the darkness. Barrett let out a shaky breath. "That was—" John was already moving again. "It's not alone." The security guard was still shaking, gripping his radio with white knuckles. "Thank you. John cut him off. "How many?" The guard swallowed hard. "I don't know. They hit the central control panel. The locks, the power, everything was fried. We lost count." John didn't like that answer. Barrett clicked his radio. "Dispatch, we need an update." "How many enclosures are breached?" The reply came fast. "At least 5 large predators, some herbivores in open areas. We've got officers moving to secure exits, but we don't have enough personnel to contain this." John's stomach twisted. 5 predators. That was not a coincidence. Barrett looked at him. "They weren't just trying to scare people this time?" John nodded. "They want this place destroyed for good." The first 2 animal escapes had been damage control, something the zoo could recover from. But this? If multiple large predators got loose, if someone got killed, the zoo wouldn't just be shut down. It would be a disaster, and whoever was behind this knew that. John turned to the guard. "Where's the emergency animal containment team?" The man licked his lips, still rattled. They're trying to regroup, but—" Barrett swore under his breath. "We can't wait." John already knew that. He scanned the darkened pathways, trying to think. 5 large predators. That meant at least another lion, maybe a tiger, and God knew what else. They had to move fast. A rustling sound made him spin. At first, he saw nothing, just the wind shifting the leaves. Then a low huff reached his ears. Not wind, breath. John's entire body went rigid. Then slowly, his eyes adjusted to the darkness. A hulking shape moved just beyond the pathway, low to the ground. A tiger, not crouching, not lunging, just watching, the orange and black stripes barely visible in the dim light. John knew better than to move suddenly. "Tigers don't stalk unless they're hungry," he murmured. Barrett's voice was low. "I don't like how close it is." John exhaled slowly. "Me neither." Then from the distance, a new sound. An engine. Barrett turned. "That's—" Headlights cut through the darkness as a zoo jeep skidded onto the pathway, kicking up dust and gravel. A figure in a zoo uniform was at the wheel, shouting into a megaphone. The moment the tiger saw the jeep, it bolted. John let out a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The jeep screeched to a stop beside them. The driver, a woman with dark hair pulled into a tight bun, glared down at them. "Are you two insane?" John didn't have time for the lecture. "Where's the containment team?" The woman, still breathing hard, wiped sweat from her forehead. "What's left of it? They're doing their best, but this wasn't a normal break. This was coordinated." Barrett shot John a look. "Told you." The woman exhaled. "We've got officers and staff trying to round up the smaller animals, but if we don't get the big ones contained soon—" "We know," John interrupted. "Where do you need us?" The woman hesitated. Then she gestured toward the north side of the zoo. "The second lion is still loose. We lost track of it near the safari section." John nodded. Barrett clicked his radio. "All units, we're heading to the north side." The woman gave him a sharp look. "You two aren't trained for this," John smirked. "Neither are the guys who did this." She stared at him for a moment, then exhaled. "Fine, but don't do anything stupid." John climbed into the jeep. No promises. As they sped off toward the next disaster, John's mind was already working. This wasn't over. Whoever had set this up was still out there. And he had a feeling that when they found them, it wasn't going to be a clean arrest. It was going to be a war. John Harris gripped the roll bar of the zoo jeep as it lurched down the narrow dirt path, the headlights bouncing across the trees and casting jagged shadows against the enclosures. The woman driving, her name was Kate Dawson, one of the zoo's senior animal handlers, handled the wheel with the steady control of someone who had been in high-pressure situations before. Barrett was in the passenger seat, his hand resting on his holstered gun, his eyes scanning the darkness. The police radios were still crackling, dispatch calling in reports from all over the zoo. Loose predators, frightened civilians, officers spread too thin. But the north side of the zoo, the safari section, was the priority now, because that's where the second lion had vanished. John's mind was racing. This wasn't just about property damage anymore. Whoever had done this wasn't trying to scare people. They were trying to destroy the zoo. If an animal killed someone, that would be it. The board of directors would have no choice. The city would shut it down, sell the land, and whoever was behind this would win. The jeep skidded to a stop at the edge of a winding footpath leading toward the open plains exhibit. Kate killed the engine, the sudden silence pressing in on them. "We need to be careful," she said, her voice steady but tense. "A lion that's loose in an unfamiliar environment is unpredictable. He's scared, confused, and that makes him dangerous." John nodded, stepping down from the jeep. "How big is this one?" 500 pounds, Kate said. "Older male. He's never been outside his enclosure before." Barrett exhaled. "Fantastic!" John took a slow step forward, his boots pressing into damp soil. The safari section of the zoo was different from the enclosed cages, wide open spaces designed to mimic the animal's natural habitat. That meant the lion could be anywhere. Kate pulled a tranquilizer rifle from the back of the jeep, checked the chamber, and handed another to John. "You ever use one of these?" John took the rifle, testing its weight. "Not exactly, but I can figure it out." Kate gave him a sharp look. "You don't get second shots with this. If we don't hit him clean, we risk making him more aggressive." John adjusted his grip. "Understood." Barrett pulled his own weapon, a standard-issue Glock, but his finger hovered off the trigger. "Let's try not to use this one." They moved in a slow formation, spreading out just enough to cover more ground, but staying within earshot. The night air was thick, humid, the distant sounds of sirens still carrying through the trees. Then John saw it. A paw print, fresh, deep, leading away from the main walking path and into the tall grass. He knelt, running his fingers over the imprint. The weight was heavy, the edges crisp. The lion had been here recently. He raised his fist, signaling the others to stop. Kate and Barrett froze. Then a rustling sound in the grass. John lifted the tranquilizer rifle, his body going still, his breath controlled. The rustling grew louder. A shadow moved through the grass, low and slow. Then a shape emerged, small, fast, darting. A gazelle. John exhaled sharply as the animal bolted past him, disappearing into the darkness. But something about its movement wasn't right. It was running from something. Then he heard it. A deep, low growl. John turned his head slowly, his instincts flaring to life. 20 feet away, partially hidden in the tall grass, the lion crouched. Its golden eyes gleamed in the darkness, its muscles coiled, its tail flicking in slow, deliberate motions. It wasn't scared. It was hunting. Kate barely breathed. "He's locked onto us." Barrett tightened his grip on his gun. "We need to move. Now." John kept his stance firm. "If we move too fast, we trigger the chase instinct." The lion took a slow step forward, its massive paws pressing into the dirt without a sound. John raised the tranquilizer rifle, lining up the shot. He had to be perfect. The right angle, the right timing. If he missed, then the lion lunged. John fired. The dart hit, embedding deep in the lion's shoulder just as it leaped. But it wasn't enough. The tranquilizer wouldn't take effect immediately, and 500 pounds of raw muscle and instinct was already airborne. John barely had time to react before the impact hit. The lion's massive body collided with him, knocking him backward, the rifle flying from his grip. He hit the ground hard, the breath ripping from his lungs. The lion's claws raked against his arm, sharp pain searing through his jacket. He barely managed to twist away before the teeth could find his throat. Then a second shot rang out. Kate fired another tranquilizer round, the dart sinking into the lion's flank. The lion staggered. Its head shook violently, its limbs suddenly sluggish. The tranquilizers were working. John scrambled backward as the lion let out a slow, confused growl, swaying on its feet. Then, finally, its legs buckled. The great beast collapsed. The night was silent again. John exhaled, his hands shaking as he pressed his palm against the fresh claw marks on his arm. Kate rushed forward, already checking the lion's breathing. He's sedated. We need to move him before he wakes up. Barrett clicked his radio. Suspect contained. Repeat, lion is down. Send transport. John sat up, his body still throbbing. He looked at Kate. You good? She nodded, her breath unsteady. Yeah, you? John smirked. Been worse. Barrett exhaled, running a hand through his hair. I hate this job. John laughed softly, but the relief was short-lived, because something still wasn't right. The timing of this attack, the way the zoo had been hit twice in one night. The people behind this weren't just trying to create chaos. They were testing the system. John stood, wiping blood from his arm. Barrett looked at him. What now? John glanced back toward the darkened zoo. Now we find the real threat. Barrett's radio crackled again. But this time, the dispatcher's voice wasn't just reporting another loose animal. She was panicked. Shots fired. Repeat. Shots fired at the zoo entrance. Barrett's entire body went rigid. John's stomach turned to stone. This wasn't just about the animals anymore. The real attack was just getting started. John Harris was already running before Barrett could finish his radio call. His body screamed from the impact of the lion's attack, his muscles stiff from the chase, but none of it mattered. Shots fired at the entrance meant someone had escalated things past sabotage. This wasn't just about forcing the zoo to close anymore. This was a warning, or worse, a cover-up. Barrett was right beside him, his gun drawn as they sprinted through the darkened pathways. The air smelled of damp earth and adrenaline, the echoes of distant sirens cutting through the night. Somewhere behind them, Kate Dawson and her team were securing the sedated lion, but there was no time to stay. Whatever was happening at the front of the zoo was more immediate, more deadly. As they neared the entrance, John slowed, pulling Barrett into the shadows of a nearby tree. The parking lot was a mess of flashing lights, police cars parked at odd angles, officers with weapons drawn. A handful of zoo employees stood near the visitor center, their hands raised, wide-eyed and confused. But at the center of it all, standing near the entrance gate, were three men in dark clothing. One was holding a gun. Barrett's jaw tightened. Idiots think they can intimidate cops now. John's eyes locked onto the armed man, his stance casual, almost bored. He wasn't pointing the gun at anyone, but he wasn't putting it away either. The other two flanked him, their body language tense. This wasn't a full-blown shootout. Not yet. John whispered, "They're not here to kill. If they wanted that, this would already be over." Barrett nodded. "So what's the play?" John exhaled, sizing them up. "Let's find out." Before Barrett could stop him, John stepped forward. The officers closest to the scene snapped their heads toward him, one raising a hand to hold him back. But John ignored them, his focus locked on the man with the gun. The man noticed. His smirk widened slightly, as if he had been waiting for this exact moment. John stopped a few feet away, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. "You planning on using that, or are we just supposed to be impressed?" The man tilted his head. "Depends on who's asking." Barrett stepped up beside John, his badge now visible. "Detective Barrett, Fairhaven PD. And this here is the guy who just put down a 500-pound lion with nothing but a dart and a bad attitude." The man's smirk faltered for just a second. Then it was back. "Cute. But I don't answer to small-town cops," John sighed. "Then maybe you'll answer to me." The man's expression shifted. "Oh, I know who you are. You're the guy who doesn't know when to walk away. John took a step forward. You made this personal the moment you turned this into something bigger than a real estate scam. Letting animals loose, fine. Breaking things, fine. But now you're putting people in the crossfire. The man's fingers twitched around the gun. You think you've got this figured out, old man? John smirked. I know I do. The man exhaled through his nose, weighing his options. Then, to John's surprise, he slowly tucked the gun into his waistband, his shoulders relaxing as he took a step back. We're done here. Barrett's hand was still hovering over his own holstered weapon. That easy. The man met his gaze. For now. Without another word, he turned and walked toward a black SUV idling near the curb. His two men followed, slipping into the vehicle without another glance. The doors shut, the engine rumbled, and then the SUV peeled out of the lot, disappearing into the night. Barrett cursed under his breath. We should have taken them in. John shook his head. Not here, not now. They wanted to send a message. And they just did. Barrett exhaled, watching the taillights vanish. Yeah, but I don't like what it means. John turned back toward the scene. The officers were lowering their weapons, checking on the zoo employees. No one was hurt. The damage was psychological, not physical. John glanced at Barrett. They're escalating. Barrett's expression darkened. And the next time, they won't just be flashing guns. John ran a hand through his hair, exhaustion settling in now that the immediate danger had passed. We need to get ahead of this. Barrett nodded. We're not playing defense anymore. John already knew that. He just wasn't sure how far he'd have to go before this ended, and something told him they weren't done with this night just yet. John Harris sat on the hood of a police cruiser, his arms crossed, watching as the chaos at the zoo slowly settled into uneasy quiet. Officers were still securing the area, talking to staff, collecting statements. The flashing red and blue lights painted the night in sharp bursts of color, casting long shadows against the pavement. Barrett stood nearby, talking to the ranking officer on site, his tone low and serious. John didn't need to hear the words to know the conversation wasn't a good one. The men who had shown up waving guns weren't just small-time muscle. They had made their point. This wasn't a game. The next move wouldn't be subtle. John exhaled slowly, his body still humming with the raw energy of the night. His shoulder throbbed from the lion's claws, his ribs ached from the chase, but none of it mattered. The job wasn't done. Then he heard small, hesitant footsteps approaching. He looked up. Emily Dawson stood a few feet away, half hidden behind her father's leg, clutching the fabric of his jeans with tiny fingers. Her curls were messy, her eyes still red from crying, but there was something steady in the way she looked at him. David Dawson gave John a nod. She wanted to see you. John pushed off the car, crouching slightly to meet the girl's eye level. Hey, kid. Emily hesitated, then let go of her father's leg and took a small step forward. She wiped at her nose with the sleeve of her jacket, shifting her weight from foot to foot. You saved me, she said softly. John wasn't sure how to respond to that. He scratched the back of his head. You were real brave back there. Emily shook her head. I was scared. John gave her a small smile. Being scared and being brave aren't opposites. You can be both. She considered that, her little brows furrowing in thought. Then after a beat, she took another step forward and wrapped her small arms around his waist. John stiffened. He hadn't expected that. For a moment he wasn't sure what to do. He had spent so long avoiding connection, keeping himself apart from people. He had convinced himself it was easier that way. But this little girl, who had been through so much in one night, was holding on to him like he was something solid, something safe. Slowly he rested a hand on the back of her head. You're okay now. Emily nodded against his jacket. David cleared his throat. I don't know how to thank you. John pulled back slightly, looking at him. You don't have to. David shook his head. That's not how this works. He let out a breath. If you ever need anything, you call me. Doesn't matter what. John nodded, appreciating the weight in his voice. Emily finally let go, taking a step back, rubbing at her eyes again. Are you going to stop the bad guys? John's jaw tightened. He crouched a little lower, meeting her gaze. Yeah, kid, I am. Emily gave a small, serious nod. as if deciding she believed him. David rested a hand on her shoulder. "We should get home." John watched them walk away, the girl still clutching her father's hand tightly. He let out a slow breath. Then he turned back toward the mess still unfolding around the zoo. He had made a promise. Now it was time to keep it. John Harris never liked attention. He had spent most of his life slipping in and out of places unnoticed, doing the job and moving on. But that wasn't going to happen this time. Fairhaven wasn't the kind of town where things like this happened often. People talked, stories spread. It didn't take long for the town to start seeing him differently. The morning after the chaos at the zoo, John found himself at Miller's Diner, a quiet little place with checkered floors and faded leather booths. He had been going there for years, always ordering the same thing: black coffee, eggs over easy toast. The kind of routine that made him feel like life was simple, even if it never really was. But this morning was different. The moment he walked through the door, conversations quieted, heads turned. People didn't just glance at him, they looked, some with curiosity, some with gratitude, others with a quiet kind of respect he hadn't felt in years. He sighed. He slid into his usual booth near the window, nodding at the waitress, Linda, who had been working there since before he moved to town. She was already pouring his coffee before he even asked. "You're famous now, you know," she said with a smirk. John grunted. "Not interested," Linda chuckled, setting the cup down. Too late for that. As if to prove her point, the old man at the counter, Roger McMillan, who had run the hardware store since the 70s, turned in his stool. "Hell of a thing you did, John." John looked up. "Wasn't just me." Roger shook his head. "Still, ain't many people who'd throw themselves at a bear and a lion in the same night." John didn't have a response to that, so he just took a sip of coffee. The conversation picked up again around him, but he could still feel the occasional glance in his direction. He had never liked being the center of attention, but he wasn't about to start snapping at people just for being grateful. Then the door chimed. Barrett walked in, looking like he had slept even less than John had. His tie was loose, his sleeves rolled up, his badge clipped to his belt. He spotted John and made a beeline for the booth, dropping into the seat across from him with a sigh. Linda didn't even ask before pouring him a cup of coffee. Barrett took a sip, exhaled, then met John's gaze. "We've got problems." John raised an eyebrow. "You're just figuring that out?" Barrett snorted, shaking his head. "No, I mean new problems." He set a folder down on the table. "Forensics finished going through the zoo." John glanced at the folder but didn't open it. "And?" Barrett's expression darkened. "The sabotage was worse than we thought. The power outage, not just a random failure. Someone cut into the main junction box, rewired it to short out exactly when the second gate was opened. It wasn't just bad luck. It was a calculated move." John exhaled through his nose. He had suspected as much. "And the men we caught?" Barrett frowned. "Won't talk. But here's the thing. One of them had a burner phone on him. It was wiped, but tech found one thing left behind, a text message." John finally opened the folder. A grainy screenshot of the message sat on top of the reports. 3 words: "Last warning, tonight." John's fingers tightened around the paper. "They're not done." Barrett shook his head. "Not even close." John set the paper down, thinking. The zoo had been hit twice in one night, and now they were promising one last warning. That meant whatever was coming next wasn't about intimidation anymore. It was the kill shot. "They're escalating," Barrett muttered. That message wasn't just a threat. It was a timeline. They're going to try something big. John looked out the window. The town looked peaceful, normal. People walking down the street. Kids on bikes, cars moving through intersections. But under the surface, something was coming. John had spent most of his life moving from place to place, never staying anywhere long enough to care. But now this town wasn't just a place he passed through. Now this was his town, and he wasn't going to let them take it. Barrett rubbed his face. "The problem is, we don't know what tonight means. Is it another break-in, another animal attack, or something worse?" John was already standing. He grabbed the folder and tucked it under his arm. "Then we need to be ready for all of it." Barrett stood, dropping a few bills on the table. You thinking what I'm thinking? John smirked. Probably. Barrett sighed. This is gonna suck, isn't it? John drained the last of his coffee and set the cup down. Yeah, it is. They walked out of the diner together, the quiet town still moving around them like nothing had changed. But John knew better. Tonight, everything was going to change. The weight of the upcoming night sat heavy on John Harris as he and Barrett left the diner. The sun was starting to set, casting long shadows down the quiet streets of Fairhaven. It was the kind of evening where people would be sitting on their porches, sipping iced tea, watching the world slow down. A peaceful night. At least it should have been. John had been in enough fights to know when a storm was coming. The zoo had been hit twice in one night, and the message they had intercepted was clear. Whoever was behind this wasn't done, and whatever was coming next wasn't going to be subtle. Barrett's phone buzzed. He pulled it from his pocket, glanced at the screen, and let out a sigh. The mayor wants to see us, John frowned. Now? Now. Barrett shoved the phone back into his pocket. City Hall, let's go. John exhaled. He wasn't a fan of politicians, never had been, but he also knew that if they wanted to stop what was coming, they needed the town's support. And if the mayor was calling, it meant this had finally gotten big enough that even the suits couldn't ignore it anymore. They took Barrett's car, weaving through the quiet streets, past shops closing for the night, past families settling in for their evening routines. The normalcy of it all only made John more certain that tonight was going to be anything but. City Hall was a modest brick building with a flagpole out front, the American flag barely rustling in the breeze. Barrett parked out front, and they stepped inside, the cool, air-conditioned lobby feeling almost too still compared to the weight of everything happening outside. The mayor was waiting for them in his office, standing by the window with his arms crossed. He was a tall man in his 50s, dressed in a crisp suit that looked out of place in a town like Fairhaven. His name was Thomas Reed, and John had never met him, but he could already tell the man was uncomfortable. Reed turned when they walked in. Detective Mr. Harris. John wasn't sure whether to be annoyed or amused that the mayor knew his name. Barrett didn't waste time. What's this about? Reed gestured to the chairs in front of his desk. Sit. Neither of them did. The mayor sighed, rubbing his forehead. Fine, I'll make this quick. We've got a situation, and I need to know how bad it really is. John folded his arms. That depends on how much you already know. Reed let out a slow breath. I know that in the last 24 hours, 2 dangerous animals were let loose at the zoo. Armed men showed up at the entrance. And now I've got half the town terrified that this place is turning into some kind of battleground. His eyes flicked between them. What I don't know is why, and I don't like not knowing. Barrett nodded. Then here's the short version. Someone wants the zoo shut down permanently. First they tried scaring people. That didn't work, so now they're escalating. Reed narrowed his eyes. Escalating how? John set the folder on the mayor's desk and flipped it open. The grainy screenshot of the intercepted message was on top. Last warning, tonight. Reed stared at it. Barrett leaned forward. We think they're planning a major event tonight. Bigger than before. Reed's jaw tightened. How bad? John met his gaze. Bad enough that you should be considering emergency response plans. The room was silent for a long moment. Then Reed exhaled, walking back toward the window. I can't put the entire town on lockdown based on a text message. No one's asking you to, Barrett said. But we are asking for support. More officers at the zoo, more eyes on the streets. We don't know how they're going to hit us, but we know it's coming. Reed turned back to them. And what if we make a show of force and nothing happens? John tilted his head. Then you still send a message. You tell these people that the town isn't just going to roll over and let them take what they want. Reed studied him, considering. Then he walked over to his desk, picked up his phone, and dialed a number. Chief, it's Reed. Increase patrols around the zoo. Double the units starting now, and get a fire response team on standby. He paused, listening. No, I don't care if it's a false alarm. Do it. He hung up and looked at them. You've got your backup. Barrett nodded. Good call. Reed sighed. I hope so. Then he eyed John. I heard what you did. The way you handled yourself at the zoo. The town owes you." John shook his head. "I don't do this for favors." Reed smirked slightly. "Yeah, I figured." Then his expression hardened. "Just stop this before it gets worse." John didn't make promises he couldn't keep. They left City Hall, stepping back into the cooling night air. The town still looked peaceful, quiet, but John knew better. Barrett exhaled. "We've got backup. Now what?" John scanned the streets, watching as a couple of patrol cars rolled past, their presence already more noticeable than before. "Now," he said, "we make sure we're in the right place when it all goes down." Barrett nodded. "You think they'll hit the zoo again?" John considered it. "Maybe, but they might go bigger. If the goal is to make sure this place never recovers, they won't just stop at animals getting loose." Barrett muttered a curse. "So where do we go?" John turned toward the direction of the zoo. "We go where the fight is." The town was watching now. The people who had pulled the strings in the shadows were realizing that they weren't scaring people into submission anymore. And that meant they were going to get desperate. John had spent his life fighting desperate men. He knew how dangerous they could be, but he also knew how to stop them. And tonight he was going to make damn sure Fairhaven wouldn't have to live in fear. John Harris had spent the better part of his life chasing ghosts, some from war, some from places he barely remembered, but they all followed him, settling deep in his bones. He had learned to live with them, with the weight of past decisions pressing down on him like an old injury that never quite healed. He had never been the kind of man to look for peace, because men like him didn't find it. But tonight, as he stood at the edge of Fairhaven Zoo, watching the quiet before the storm, he realized he might be fighting for it, not for himself, but for this town. The increased police presence was noticeable. Patrol cars were stationed at each entrance, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Officers moved in pairs, their radios crackling as they checked in. The zoo staff that remained worked in tense silence, eyes scanning the shadows for signs of something about to break. Barrett stood next to him, hands on his hips, watching the same scene unfold. "They're either going to hit us hard, or they're going to wait for us to get tired and let our guard down." John nodded. "They don't have time for patience. This is their last shot." Barrett sighed. "Yeah, that's what I'm afraid of." John didn't say it, but he was afraid of it too. These people weren't just vandals or small-time crooks trying to make a quick buck. They had played this game carefully, systematically, and now that the town had pushed back, they were going to be reckless. A movement near the west perimeter caught his attention, a figure darting between trees, too fast, too cautious to be a cop. John grabbed Barrett's arm, nodding toward the movement. Barrett saw it too. They moved. John didn't need to be told what to do. His boots hit the dirt silently as he ran, following the figure through the trees. He could hear Barrett behind him, keeping pace. The wind was still, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and the distant musk of the animals. The world shrank down to the chase, to the rhythmic pounding of his own heartbeat. The figure reached a fence, hesitated for a second too long, and that's all John needed. He tackled the man from behind, slamming him into the ground with enough force to knock the wind out of him. The guy let out a strangled grunt, trying to twist free, but John had him locked. Barrett was there in an instant, yanking the man's arms behind his back, securing him with cuffs. "Gotcha, you son of a bitch," Barrett muttered. The man coughed, turning his head slightly. John recognized him, one of Holt's guys. John grabbed the front of his jacket and hauled him upright. "You planning something special tonight?" The man smirked, even through the pain. "You already know the answer." John's grip tightened. "Then why don't you tell me anyway?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "You think stopping me changes anything? You think I'm the only one out here?" John felt his stomach turn cold. He shoved the guy toward Barrett. "Get him locked down." Barrett didn't argue. He pulled out his radio. "Suspect in custody. We need every available unit sweeping the perimeter. We're not done." John barely heard him. His mind was racing. The man wasn't lying. This wasn't over. Somewhere, Beyond the quiet of the zoo, beyond the reach of the headlights and radios, someone else was waiting. Someone with a plan. John had seen too many nights like this, the ones where everything felt just a little too still, the ones where the real fight was only seconds away from starting. He exhaled, rolling his shoulders. The night wasn't over yet, and neither was he. John Harris stood at the edge of the zoo's main entrance, the cool night air settling over Fairhaven like a heavy blanket. The lights from the police cars flickered against the trees, their rotating reds and blues casting shifting shadows across the pavement. The suspect they had caught was already being loaded into the back of a squad car, his smirk finally gone, replaced by the empty stare of a man who knew he had lost. But John wasn't looking at him. His eyes were on the darkness beyond the fence, the places where the trees pressed in close, the corners where another threat could still be lurking. He had been in too many fights to believe that just because you caught one man, the war was over. Barrett stepped up beside him, rubbing a hand down his face. "He's not talking." John didn't look away from the shadows. "Doesn't matter. We already know what's coming." Barrett let out a slow breath. They wanted to make this town afraid. They wanted people to panic, to demand the zoo be shut down. They failed. He turned slightly, glancing at John. "You think they'll try again?" John didn't answer immediately. He listened to the night, to the sound of the wind rustling through the trees, to the distant voices of officers coordinating their next moves. Then he nodded. "Yeah, but it won't be tonight." Barrett watched him carefully. "You don't have to stay, you know. This isn't your fight." John smirked. "Sure feels like it is." Barrett chuckled. "Figured you'd say that." The tension in the air had started to ease, but John wasn't letting his guard down yet. He had spent too many years being the last line of defense in places no one else wanted to be. And even though Fairhaven was just a small town, just a quiet dot on the map, tonight had proved that quiet didn't mean safe. Kate Dawson approached from the other side of the lot, still in her zoo uniform, her hair pulled back into a messy bun. She looked exhausted but determined. "The animals are secure. Everyone's accounted for. We're shutting everything down for the night, but we'll have teams monitoring everything until morning." John nodded. "Good. That'll buy us time." Kate gave him a long look. "You're not a cop. You're not zoo security. So why are you still here?" John considered that. He didn't have a real answer, not one that made sense. He had come here for coffee, for quiet, for a routine that didn't involve being pulled back into the kind of fights he thought he had left behind. But that wasn't what happened. Now, he was standing here, checking enclosures, scanning the tree line for threats, making sure people were safe. Kate sighed, shaking her head. "You're a strange man, John Harris." John smirked. "You're not the first person to say that." Kate folded her arms. "Well, strange or not, you helped save a lot of lives tonight. You could have walked away, but you didn't." John didn't reply. Kate gave him a nod before turning back toward the zoo. Her steps slow, weary. Barrett let out a breath. "So what now?" John exhaled, rolling his shoulders. "Now? We get ready for whatever's next." Barrett nodded. "Fair enough." He clapped John on the shoulder. "Try to get some sleep. I'll call you if anything changes." John watched as Barrett walked toward his car, speaking into his radio one last time before disappearing into the night. The zoo was quiet again. Not peaceful, just quiet. John turned, staring at the darkened paths leading into the animal enclosures, at the security guards locking up, at the police officers wrapping up their work. This place wasn't just a zoo anymore. It was something worth protecting, and for the first time in a long time, John realized maybe he was too. The aftermath of the attack settled over Fairhaven, like the slow-moving fog that rolled in from the hills each morning. It wasn't the kind of fear that came with immediate danger anymore. It was something quieter, heavier, the kind of weight that came from knowing how close things had come to disaster. The town had changed overnight. People moved differently. They watched their surroundings more carefully. They locked their doors, checked the news more often. But there was something else, too, something stronger. Fairhaven wasn't folding under the weight of fear. It was standing up. By midday, news of the attack had spread, not just through town, but to the state level. Officials were investigating, news vans had rolled in from neighboring counties, and the zoo had become the center of a conversation that was bigger than just one town's battle against corruption. People were paying attention now, and that meant whoever had been pulling the strings no longer had the cover of silence. John Harris watched all of this unfold from a distance, leaning against the railing outside Miller's diner, his coffee cooling in his hands. He had never been the kind of man who stuck around long enough to see the dust settle. He had been in too many places that didn't want to be saved, too many fights where the end result didn't really change anything. But Fairhaven was different. He had walked into this mess thinking he was just another bystander. But now he was something else. The diner door swung open behind him, and Barrett stepped out, adjusting his sleeves. He looked just as exhausted as John felt, but there was something in his posture that said he wasn't letting it slow him down. "They're calling it a miracle," Barrett muttered, leaning against the railing next to him. John took a sip of coffee. "They calling it that? Or are the reporters calling it that?" Barrett smirked. "Same thing, isn't it?" John exhaled, watching the street. "Town's different now," Barrett nodded. "Yeah, but not in a bad way." The town had spent the day pulling itself back together. The zoo staff had already begun repairing the damage, reinforcing enclosures, installing new security measures. Local businesses had donated supplies, volunteers had stepped up, and people who had never spent a second thinking about the zoo were suddenly calling it their zoo. Fear hadn't won, and that meant the people responsible for this had lost. Barrett sighed, rubbing his jaw. "We've got more names. After we picked up Holt's guy, some of the smaller players started folding. Turns out this thing goes deeper than we thought. Developers, politicians, business owners. This wasn't just about shutting down the zoo. It was about control." John wasn't surprised. "It always is," Barrett nodded. "Yeah, but here's the thing. They didn't get control. This town's pushing back. The mayor's been talking about increasing funding for the zoo, making it an official protected site. The people behind this? They thought they were going to tear it down, make a fortune." He smirked. "Now they're watching their investment go up in flames." John nodded slowly. The people behind this weren't going to disappear overnight. They would try again, maybe in another way. But they had been exposed now. They had lost their momentum. Barrett patted his shoulder. "Anyway, there's something happening at the zoo in a couple of hours. A gathering, some kind of, I don't know, a show of unity. Thought you might want to be there." John hesitated. Barrett sighed. "Look, you can play the lone wolf routine all you want, but whether you like it or not, you're part of this now. And people want to see you." John smirked. "That sounds like a problem," Barrett laughed. "Yeah, well, it's one you brought on yourself." By the time they arrived at the zoo, the sun was beginning to set, casting a golden glow over the enclosures and walkways. The gates were still locked for official business, but inside, people had gathered. Zoo staff, police officers, business owners, families. It wasn't an official event, but it didn't need to be. This was Fairhaven standing together. John lingered near the back, watching as people spoke, laughed, hugged. Kate Dawson was talking with a group of zookeepers near the lion enclosure, gesturing animatedly. Barrett was off near the mayor, likely discussing security measures. And then, through the crowd, Emily Dawson spotted him. She tugged on her father's sleeve, whispering something, and before John could react, she was running toward him. He barely had time to register it before she wrapped her arms around his waist, hugging him tight. John blinked, looking down at the small girl now attached to him. David approached, smiling. "She's been waiting to see you again." Emily looked up at him, her voice small. "Did you stop the bad guys?" John crouched down, resting a hand on her shoulder. "For now." She studied him, then nodded, apparently satisfied. "Good," David sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I meant what I said before. If you ever need anything—" John shook his head. "You don't owe me anything." David smirked. "Yeah, well, doesn't change the fact that I want to." Emily pulled something from behind her back. holding it out to him. "This is for you." John looked down. It was a drawing, crayon on thick paper, a figure, him, standing in front of a giant bear and a lion, both looking more friendly than terrifying. Next to him was a small stick figure with curly hair, holding his hand. At the top, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "John the Brave." John swallowed against something he wasn't ready to name. He folded the paper carefully, tucking it into his jacket. "Thank you, kid." Emily beamed. John stood, looking at David, then at the town gathered around him. He had spent his whole life moving from place to place, never staying long enough to care. But this time, things felt different. Maybe for the first time he didn't need to keep moving. Maybe this town had given him something he hadn't realized he was looking for. Maybe Fairhaven had become home. John Harris never put much thought into legacies. He had spent most of his life in places that didn't leave room for reflection, in places where the only thing that mattered was making it to the next day. He had walked through war, through cities filled with smoke and fear, through towns that had no memory of the people who had tried to save them. He had accepted a long time ago that when he was gone, he would be just another name lost to time. But as he stood near the lion enclosure, watching the town of Fairhaven come together in a way he never expected, he felt something shift. The zoo had always been just another part of the town, a place for families on weekends, for kids on school trips. But tonight, it was something else. It was a symbol of what Fairhaven was willing to fight for. It had survived attacks, sabotage, and a war waged in the shadows. And instead of breaking, it had become stronger. John wasn't sure where he fit into that. He wasn't a cop, wasn't a zookeeper, wasn't a politician. He wasn't someone who gave speeches or took credit for anything. He was just a man who had stepped in when he saw something worth protecting. Barrett found him standing near the fence, arms crossed, watching as people continued to talk and laugh, the tension of the past few days slowly fading into something lighter. "You look like you're thinking too much," Barrett said, leaning against the fence beside him. John smirked. "You know me, always the thoughtful type." Barrett chuckled. "The mayor wants to give you a medal." John groaned. "Absolutely not." "Figured you'd say that." Barrett shook his head. "Doesn't change the fact that half the town sees you as a hero now." John exhaled. "I didn't do it for that." "I know. That's why it stuck." They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, watching as Kate Dawson helped her team check on the animals, as David and Emily Dawson laughed together near the picnic tables, as townspeople who barely knew each other a week ago now stood side by side, talking like old friends. Fairhaven had changed, and so had John. Barrett glanced at him. "So, you sticking around?" John hesitated. He had spent years moving, never staying anywhere long enough to put down roots. That had always been the plan, but looking around he realized something. He didn't want to leave. He wanted to stay. For the first time in years, the road ahead wasn't pulling him away. He turned to Barrett, smirking. "Yeah, I think I am." Barrett grinned, clapping him on the shoulder. "Good. This town could use someone like you." John looked at the people gathered, at the zoo standing against the odds, at the town that had refused to let itself be pushed around. For the first time in a long time, he felt like he belonged, and maybe, just maybe, that was the only legacy that really mattered.